real money going? Where is the real power being exercised to sustain it? What are the underlying assumptions of what constitutes development? Is it infrastructure rather than reducing inequities?
That gets to the question we work on in China, which is what are the rules for China growing abroad. So now, as China goes abroad, maybe you're shocked, but the China Business Associations are developing human rights and environmental standards for, say, mining in Africa. So this is a separate set of questions. What are the AIAB rules? I mean, in theory, you know, our colleagues many years ago took on the World Bank, you know,
Right.
Brent Blackwell or Bruce Rich,
Yes.
to hold them to their word. So the question is not about is there giving money for infrastructure, but what is the reality of the AIAB rules?
And that's a Chinese
Well, no, but that's a separate.
initiative, right?
Well, no, but that's a separate question, because the interesting question there is the world knows, as India certainly knows, about One Belt, One Road, right? And the world knows AIB is a China creation, but it is multi. So is AIB a arm of China One Belt, One Road, or is it indeed something else? So these are questions, I think you all know, AIB, the actual development was by Natalie Lichtenstein. She did the rules. And Natalie, you know, Jerry Cohen's student at Harvard, and went by the book of the ADB, so as far as anybody said so far, it is following the Bretton Woods Western multilateral protocol for better or worse, not China. So that's a question.
And is not therefore an alternative to, it is not a way of pursuing large-scale development with a focus on infrastructure without the constraints.
Well, so these are the questions I get here on Wednesday, and Professor Sark is talking about the Namada Project. So this was the first object of the World Bankers campaign, the Namada Project, to get the World Bank seriously, to get engaged on the environment, right? So that's a separate question about will.
Just to add to what Suraj said, one of the things that this exercise of state history has did is that the state governments, firstly, it's an official report of the government. Now, Amartya Sen may write whatever words of wisdom in his books, but when it comes to the bureaucracy and discussions within the government, that's something external. He may have great wisdom, but it's not official. It's unofficial. Right? So there is that strong sense that you are bound by something that's official. So which is why we had to fight, because the assumption of the HDRO was that you needed an objective report, and it's impossible to get a state government to do an objective report. Now, what they didn't understand is how things do work in a country like India, where there's, the state officials and the state leaders do have a lot of respect for scholars and academics and so on. To engage them and to work with them is not something that's ruled out. And the fact that we didn't have any international consultants certainly helped. So that way it gave a certain imprimatur of authority to what's in there. The other important point is India, it's a shame that India developed the world's most sophisticated statistical system. No other country had it in this way, with statistical officers appointed at the very grassroots level. India was responsible for helping the United Nations devise a statistical system so that there's comparable data from across the UN member countries. And for a country that's done all that, for them to then say, this lot, these statistical officers are some, very low in the pecking order, and not even called to a meeting at the district level by the district authorities to say, what have you got to say, was a very sorry state of affairs. So one of the things that the HDR process did is it matters that, you had no data on how many girls and boys are in school. Right? Only when you embark on the exercise, you confront that and you say, there is no, we must do something about it. So I think we still have a long way to go in terms of, revitalizing a very sophisticated statistical system. with very good sound people who can devise intelligent sample designs that capture a lot at reasonably low cost. So these are things that are byproducts, but so one hopes that in this SDG exercise as well, you may say, oh, so many indicators, this is so cumbersome. No, but if it strengthens the veracity and the kind of functioning of the statistical system in this country, we would be making a big headway, and it's not discovering anything, it is recovering a quality and a standard that had once been established.
Sorry, you want to add something there? Or?
Yeah, just to say, for the Chhattisgarh, we have goal 16, peace, justice and governance. Chhattisgarh is known for left-wing extremism. Okay, so how do you sort of address that within your frame of peace, justice and governance? Okay, but we were able to do that. We were able to analyze the situation based. Quite often, government itself doesn't know what data it has. Okay, because the police authorities that routinely produce data with regard to crime, with regard to number of kills, with regard to number of casualties, with regard to civilian loss of life, etc. The fact of the matter is that there I find these exercises useful. It begins a conversation. Okay, now if we have to report on what is the police to population ratio in Chhattisgarh, people start looking for that information which is available but not used.
We have students around the room. I want to make sure a term that has come up several times, HDRO. Anybody not understand HDRO? It's been mentioned several times. I'm looking around, but I can't get the students to respond. Do you know what HDRO is? In the back? Okay, good. That's what I wanted. I wanted a negative head. Who else? HDRO, that's what we're talking about. So it's very interesting to see because the dynamics between what HDRO is doing, state level, bureaucracies, use of statistics and so on. This happens to be the Human Development Report Office, which is a group of offices located in the, I forget what floor it's on now, at UNDP headquarters in New York, and they coordinate all of these efforts and they issue many publications in addition to the Human Development Report. There are a whole series of background papers connected with each Human Development Report. And each Human Development Report has a theme, and it often becomes a framework for understanding new direction in international development. But again, as I said earlier today, at least in my perspective, that is meaningful to those of us who really care about those things, as you do. But it kind of the eyes glaze over of those who are operating at the higher levels of finance, at central banks and of ministries of finance, who are dealing with such things as the investments in infrastructure through whatever sources they can find to get them, and with the making efforts to reduce the constraints placed upon them, right? Is that?
Absolutely.
But we had another question, I think, and some other questions wanted to come up. Please.
So, one of the question and sort of a comment and an observation that I've made.
We know you well enough to know we'll be enriched by that.
So, since morning that we've been discussing about human development and human rights and development and the entire policy framework, this is the first panel where we actually entered the aspect of environmental law, and which I think is extremely important, because when you see right to education and right to health and all of these rights, they can be provided by some other mechanism, but environment is something that we're all common consumers of, and if you're not taking proper responsibility of it, well, your right to education or right to health and all of that will just be quite unnecessary if you don't have a proper environment to live in. So starting with that, I feel like environmental law in the current international as well as domestic scenario is at a position where it is definitely not taken seriously by states or the local bodies at all, which is quite evident from the manner how the Paris Agreement is going right now, and how just generally the Ministry of Environment and Forest in India is functioning, and how the coastal regulation zone Bombay coast, and there's a lot of illegal construction and everything that keeps on going on. And so environmental law is taken for granted at all of these paradigms, and at the same time, especially with regards to, say, the Bombay High Court, they do not give judgments that favor environmental law and build on jurisprudence of environmental law in a manner that is in consonance with human rights and development, so as to give it the importance that it should ideally be given. And neither is this importance being seen at the international level. So like in academic spheres, we understand how important this is, but then like in the practical aspect of it, it's not really coming out that way. So then how do we balance and how do we incorporate environment in this conversation of human rights and development, because it is a definite conclusion that we cannot take this issue for granted. So then where is it that we fit in? Because even sustainable development goals, they definitely are in consonance with the manner in which environment should be incorporated in this discourse. But if the implementation is not happening either at the international or the domestic level, then well, to a certain extent, even the SDGs certainly it reaches a deadlock.
So let's ask Armin if you can reflect on that a little bit. How do we overcome the dilemma that unless and until environmental concerns are addressing adequately the planetary needs, the related human rights will be illusory. You're not going to have the right to education, right to health, right to adequate standard of living, right to water, right to sanitation, and so on, unless and until environment. Is that what you're getting at? Unless and until the environment is adequately addressed. It's illusory to think that human rights can be related to it unless we can actually make a difference in the environment. What is the role of law in that? Which was, I think, part of your question as well. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, we place a lot of faith in international environmental norms, and the fact is that there are no international environmental agreements that are observed at the local level. You have to adopt the international agreement at the local level to make it a local domestic law. International agreements are just pie in the sky. They're rhetoric. And in addition to that, I might say that India, in the Paris Agreement that you referred to, was perhaps the least straightforward of any country that was at that agreement. About 200 countries there. India was the least straightforward because India talked about renewable energy, how it was going to have 100 gigawatts of solar and 60 gigawatts of wind. But in fact, not only are those goals unachievable, impractical, but the implication was if we're going to have renewable energy, we're going to have less coal. Everybody would assume that. Anybody in that room would have said, if you're talking about renewable energy, you mean that you're going to have more renewable energy means less fossil fuel energy. But in fact, India has a plan to double or even triple its coal in the next 15 years. So the whole thing was bizarre. That India made these statements without any likelihood of their being realized. So that's a major thing. In terms of getting environment promoted, there are public-private partnerships that are probably going to do something for the energy sector, but primarily the government doesn't have any role. The central government is not committed to environmental improvement. It's committed to development. Environment is not only a lesser value, but it's not even on the agenda of the groups in the government that ought to be concerned. ETIAG or the Ministry of the Environment, Renewable Energy. These are very ineffective units for environmental protection. They may do other things, they may be pro-development, they may do that reasonably well, I don't know. But they certainly don't do environment.
Let's have another quick comment on this framework from
just to,
Sudarshan before we
see,
go to the third and final piece.
it's been one of the serious limitations of economics as a discipline. Not to simply assumed that nature, environment and so on is something there as a mere backdrop. Economics has done that to law as well. It just assumes that the law is something, a mere backdrop. You don't have to factor it into the analysis of economics. Likewise, environment. So when Amartya Sen wrote about it, the first Human Development Report came out, the founder of the Center for Science and Environment, Anil Agarwal, made the point that you can't just think of environment as a kind of afterthought. Or now if you look at economics textbooks, there'll be the last chapter where they'll say something about, and environment is also important. The point about it is, just as economics has as a rigorous discipline factored in the role of labor and capital or organization or the factors of production, you have just assumed that this is a factor of, you've not incorporated into the analysis. So there is no way by which you can get at, China prices, the actual costs, the externalities, all of that is just sort of been shoved aside. It's only now that the discipline needs to recognize it's just made a mistake. And this is not just to blame economists, it's simply that everybody took the world around us for granted as if this is a infinite resource and we're only concerned about scarce resources and the allocation of scarce resources, and somehow the air and what's above us is in plenty and it's not scarce. So therefore we need more rigorous work in terms of, and I'm talking now about just advancing the discipline. It requires a very conscious effort to factor in. So it is therefore at one level, at the theoretical level, at the advancement of the discipline. So you can't really blame, policy makers of the day and so on to say, oh, well, what's this, suddenly environment? Because, we bring to our work what we learn and what we think is important. And so capital is terribly important. Everybody is conscious of the fact that you must increase the capital, you must get foreign direct investment, you must have infrastructure, all that comes easily. But how do you get your head around what do you do with the environment? Doesn't come so easily, and that's a fault of so just as philosophy advances, we have to so in the university that's what we ought to be doing. I mean to get into some rigorous work in terms of pushing the frontiers of the discipline so that eventually it has an impact on the practical world.
Suraj, you wanted to
Just to this one.
Yes.
Okay. In fact, it would be very good if Jindal helps the Tribal Produce Marketing Federation of India, known as TriFed, which I'm trying to help in some ways, on this entire issue of minimum support price for minor forest produce. There are 23 non-nationalized minor forest produce for which a minimum support price is to be given. Now this is supposed to be progressive move. Now please note that across the board, the minimum support price is set at a level about 60% lower than the market rate. Okay, and then when you want to make a case that gentlemen, perhaps we could consider improving the MSP, otherwise no tamarind will come into our godowns. The answer given is, but why should the tribal be paid more above the MSP? Why should we hike up the MSP? Because what he collects is a free gift of nature. So the aloe vera, the muesli, the tamarind, the bale, the n number of commodities that today are part of everybody in this room's food cycle and cosmetics and so on and so forth. Free gift of nature, therefore you cannot give them a better minimum support price. So if Jindal University wants to help the Tri-Fed in making a better case, a more reasonably argued case for improving the minimum support price for non-nationalized minor cross produce, it will be a good example. This is the sort of things we need to talk about. With all due respect to the framers of the SDGs, okay, and to the authors of international law, if you are able to make a difference at this level, then it will work. Okay, so, and of course, I still maintain that the Forest Right Act is being taken very seriously, not because of the environmental impact assessment and those standards, but because it's got to do with allotment of pattas or title rights, okay, in forest areas.
But allotment and the whole debate about how allotment is done to forests, to the tribals living in that area, then goes into a different domain. I mean, it's all about institutional settings and what we've inherited. I mean, we somehow talk about that only in academic
But
settings.
I'm just saying it gets a greater focus on the act itself and its various dimensions. Okay, today, I mean, if you go to Odisha and you travel in many of those places, you will find there is a much better awareness, okay, amongst the tribals with regard to Forest Right Act. Okay, frankly, many of them would not have heard of the Indian Constitution in its preamble, but they are aware of the Forest Rights Act and its provisions with regard to their entitlements for rights.
Before we go on, I'll make three very quick points on this organization that is pushing better rights for tribals. I sit on the board of an organization called Cultural Survival, which is an indigenous rights organization. I'd be happy to pursue that agenda with CS. Secondly, the point that Sudarshan made, 2 points that he made, I would like to echo very briefly. One is that we heard from the keynote speaker today, quite brilliantly, arguing essentially India's position on carbon and why the rest of the world should shut up and let India pursue clean carbon because its future is going to depend upon its producing the energy it's going to need in the immediate future. You've been there, done that, you're going to do the other things in the developed countries. India needs to advance on its own.
We're producing more than we need.
Now that, if I understood correctly, that calls for at least an economic analysis of the costs involved, the opportunity cost. What are the costs that economists can measure of behaving in that way of pursuing fossil fuels at a time that the rest of the world is moving away from it? You can blame the rest of the world for having created the problem, fine, and I'll agree with you on that. But if you're going to pursue growth of the carbon industry, measure the impact, and we can find human rights indicators for this too, on the right to sanitation, on the right to water, on health, on the respiratory illnesses of children, on education, on all areas that are going to have negative impacts as a result of that. And the third and final point that you made is one.
No, just on, since you mentioned what Ratin said, and some of them didn't hear Ratin, his point was that if you said, and he had a very much an Indian point with the Controller Auditor General of India in mind. He says, now if a policymaker is told that the price of solar will come down, or electric vehicles will come down, it will come down in the next 2 years, it will come down even more next 10 years, the Controller Auditor General of India is likely to ask, then why did you make the investment now? Why didn't you wait, since you know and you anticipate the price will come down, why don't you wait till it comes down?
That's right.
So this is part of the, these are practical problems of governance. It's not, there's a logic to acting now, of course there is. But if you look at, and actually, and this is a point with reference to what the CAG has done in our country, in terms of foregone revenues and so on, to the 2G and coal, it's an important point, and these are things that we need to fix. How to deal with this, because
I have to discipline myself and the others because I've not done my job as chair to give the floor to Indranil for the third presentation on this panel. With my apologies, sir, you have the floor.
Thanks, Professor Marks. Thanks, everyone. At the fag end of the day with such profound discussion on sustainable development, I feel little intimidated, and I would rather say that what I'm going to say is very that very much it's more data oriented, and what economists often tend to hide behind. And what I'm going to talk about is one key goals in the SDG framework, which is related to health, and it is about improving or increasing financial protection for the citizens of. The issue of financial protection, there is a lot of debate, and in India particularly, financial protection is being seen as or almost synonymous to increasing expansion of tax-funded insurance schemes. There have been plethora of schemes that have been announced in the last decade or so, and it's vastly expanding. National government as well as various states government have jumped into the bandwagon and have set their own schemes of tax-funded insurance, essentially to cover secondary or tertiary hospitalization care. And the official estimate shows that there are around 330 million people who are covered by insurance. So my small presentation here would be to look at this entire aspect of financial protection, how the insurance schemes, tax-funded insurance schemes, have been able to provide financial protection, to measure what is the extent of financial protection. And if you follow the debates in the after union budget, health has become one of the issues, thanks to the announcement by the finance minister on National Health Protection Scheme, which is basically, though he didn't mention the word insurance, but it given the way the policy discussions are happening, and the way our Niti Aayog friends, colleagues and friends are suggesting, it might expand the existing systems of tax-funded insurance for 50 crore people around in the bottom quintiles of the strata, and the coverage would increase from current at present. There is a scheme called Rashtriya Swasth Bima Yojana, which covers 30,000 rupees of hospitalization. The proposed National Health Protection Scheme aims to cover 5 lakh rupees of hospitalization. So before we jump into the bandwagon and embrace insurance schemes, tax-funded insurance schemes in a large and expanded, we should actually look at the experience. We have now almost a decade-long experience of how the existing insurance schemes have fared in terms of providing financial protection. So basically the objective of this paper is to assess the effectiveness of insurance schemes in providing financial protection. So I have used the NSSO data. There have been a lot of talk about NSSO data already, and this is the morbidity healthcare round. I have also used the consumer expenditure rounds to see whether whether households are facing catastrophic health expenditure or not. Catastrophic health expenditure means when people seek health care, if they need to give 10% or say 25% of their household consumption expenditure on account of healthcare needs, we call it catastrophic health expenditure. So whether catastrophic health expenditure has increased or decreased over time, what we did is to for this study, we looked at, I'm not getting into the detail of the method, but we have tried to look at match household based on their social gradient, economic quintile, their education level, and whether you choose public and private provider and your disease, because all of these affect your spending on health. So there is a method called propensity score matching where households of similar characteristics are matched. So if we just quickly go back to the extent of how health is financed in India, you'll see that most of it comes from household. Almost like 3/4 or more comes from our own pocket, and public spending is basically around less than a fourth, which is one of the lowest in the world. We'll see that. As a result, what happens? Most of our health risks are not pooled. Insurance, in theoretical sense, is supposed to pool risk of falling ill of various people into one. Now, there is this growing misconception that the way we see insurance is the only way to pool risk. In fact, a good tax-funded scheme also pools risk and bring people together. And risk pooling is one of the most effective methods in protecting people from having catastrophic health expenditure, getting impoverished. So, lack of risk pooling has led to significant impoverishment, and impoverishment, when I say impoverishment, it means that when health expenditure pushes a household below poverty line. And in India, we'll see that the number is growing. Around 50 million people in India are impoverished every year because they need to incur health expenditure. By the way, this is more than population of 191 countries. We are actually global capital of health related impoverishment. It's growing significantly. Now, in the last decade or so, this has actually, if you just look at the time period from 2004-5, you will see that impoverishment has increased far faster than the previous period. So there is a deepening, and most of the impoverishment happen because we need to purchase medicine from outside, and out of 55 million, 34 million are impoverished because they have to purchase medicines from their own pocket. Now, this is a graph showing that the negative relationship between household out-of-pocket expenditure and public spending. So, as public spending on health, which is GHG, general health expenditure, government health expenditure, as it grows as percentage of GDP, households are protected better. Their out-of-pocket expenditure as a share of total health expenditure goes down. And if we, India is actually at the top left, around 67%. Only few countries in the world have lesser public spending on health as percentage of GDP and higher out-of-pocket expenditure. So we need to clearly move away to a situation where out-of-pocket expenditure reduces. Now, how to, I'll skip this. Okay, if we look at, because we are often compared with BRICS countries, we aspire to be like in the BRICS and do like we are among the emerging economies of the world. And if you look at the columns at the right, like the rightmost columns, and if you compare public spending on health as percentage of GDP, you will see that all other BRICS countries spend at least 3 times than India. And if you compare 2004 and 2014, you will see that a lot of public spending across the world has come for health. And this is also, I would say, that the UH's Universal Health Coverage Agenda, which is very much linked to the SDG goal have actually pushed many countries to invest more on health. And if you compare our neighbor countries, even Bhutan or say Nepal spends more than what we do as percentage of GDP. Some of the Asian countries like Sri Lanka, Thailand do much better than us, and as a result our impoverishment numbers are really high. Okay. Now, this is from again NSSO data. We don't need to get into all the detail, but what I've tried to do here is to look at the growth of out-of-pocket expenditure among the poorest of the households, particularly for hospitalization. I'm coming to and I'm trying to see this because all the tax-funded insurance schemes were meant to provide free hospitalization to this poorest of the groups. And what you see, the red marked CAGR, compound average annual growth rate, as over 2004-5 and 2011-12 is highest among the poorest quintiles. So, and also high for the next second poorest. So the poorest are actually facing increasing burn of or increasing cost of healthcare expenditure, and this, and if we compare say overall with the better of sections, the rich are probably doing much better. So clearly that the insurance schemes have not been able to target this section of population and contain their growth in out-of-pocket expenditure for hospitalization. Okay, and if we look at who are covered by the insurance schemes, you'll see that the poorest and poor, around 88-89% are not covered. In 10 years of implementation of RSBY, these were the people who should have been covered entirely, if not the rich and the richest. So huge exclusion is happening. There are various reasons of exclusion. Reasons could be due to lack of information, but also deliberate under empanelment on the part of insurance agencies, or often some of the schemes you have to empanel every year. Enroll every year. So many people, due to migration or other reasons, find it difficult to enroll. So a large section is not having insurance coverage, and when they have, what is the consequence on them? Okay. Now, one of the complaints, one of the major concern that was there, that because we need to spend money from our own pocket, households do not access healthcare adequately. They do not go to hospitals adequately. Actually, if you look at we are looking at how many out of 100 people, how many are going to hospital. So if you look at total, it means out of 100 people, 4.4 people are going to hospital. And there are rural-urban gaps. In rural area, of course, it is higher. But if you compare people who do not have insurance coverage, which is not covered, and with government-funded insurance, you will see that insurance is actually bringing people to hospital. Those who have insurance are going to hospitals more in number, and this is more pronounced, the increase is more pronounced in case of urban areas. So urban people are accessing hospitalization more often than their rural counterparts, but in general there is one positive thing that insurance has brought in, which is to increase hospitalization rate. And this, but then the issue is that the increase is much more significant in case of better off people. If you look at the rural or urban top quintiles, the increase is much more pronounced. They are going more to hospitalization. It's not the case that the poor do not fall ill. So there are barriers which actually prevent the poor from seeking hospitalization, and cost could be the most significant barrier here. Okay. Now here what I have tried to do is to look at the average cost of hospitalization, I have divided population into two groups. Those who have insurance coverage, if they go to public sector or they go to private hospitals, what are they spending vis-a-vis those who do not have any insurance coverage? You will see that hospitalization on an average cost per hospitalization is lower for those who have gone to who have public funded insurance. But now the crucial issue is what choice poor people have if they do not have insurance. They would go to a public sector hospital, and if you don't have an insurance scheme, and if you go to a public sector hospital, you spend around 4,500 rupees, 4,560 per hospitalization. Now that you have an insurance, you might aspire to go to a private hospital. Your hospital cost in private hospital, if you have insurance, would shoot up to 18,000 rupees. Now these are broad numbers. The cost of hospitalization varies based on the disease, based on which part of the country you belong to, which kind of provider you choose, which strata in the society you belong to, whether you are from a rich section or you are poor. So what I try to do next is to adjust for all this and see where how insurance helps. Before going into that, we looked at the same thing across the states. If you have insurance and if you go to public sector, how much you spend, and if you go to private sector, how much you spend if you have insurance. And here I have taken median. What does median signify? That half of the population is below this number. So if we look at the numbers in public sector, most of the states the numbers are below 1,000 rupees. So if you have insurance and you go to public sector, you are probably very close to financial protection, but not the case if you go to a private hospital. Your costs are much higher. Now this is this is our result from the regression that we run, the propensity score matching. I'm not going into each of it. What I would say is that we try to look at to what extent insurance reduces your catastrophic health expenditure. So we see that it's actually 0.004, the average treatment effect on treated, which means that only 4% reduction in catastrophic expenditure, a very significant reduction, and that is at the level of 10% household expenditure. When you go to 25% household expenditure, the reduction is much sober. So actually 1% reduction. So basically those who have to spend a lot of money for hospitalization are not being protected by insurance schemes. And with these results, if we just try to sum up these results and in terms of our key findings, we see that out-of-pocket expenditure among the poor for hospitalization is increasing, which insurance schemes were supposed to target. They have failed. Large majority of poor and vulnerable are not covered by insurance, so there are definitely flaws in the mechanism. For 10 years people have not been able to have not accessed insurance. Hospitalization rates are higher among those who have insurance. They are going to hospital. Those who have insurance card, they are going to hospital, but they are not getting free care. 3 out of 100 people who go to hospital actually get free care, and majority of these are actually when you go to a public hospital. So rates in private hospitals are even lower. So virtually no one gets free care even if they have insurance when they go to public hospital. And as I said, it doesn't lead to any effective financial protection. So how much time do I have, sir?
Well, actually, minus 7 minutes. I think we're supposed to end at 6, aren't we?
Okay. So I'll not go to an alternative pathway, but what I would say in a minute or two is that there are state level if reforms that have happened in strengthening public system, and that actually is much more effective in providing financial protection than insurance driven model where you depend essentially on private sector. At some point we can
Run through this quickly.
Okay.
Very tempting.
So what I would say is, one of the things that is often said is that our public sector is not functioning. But now our public spending is one of the lowest in the world. We had, if you 20 years back, 30 years back, we had a reasonably well-functioning public sector. We have taken a lot of effort to dismantle this. Now, how to strengthen it? It has to be a path where you invest on preventive care, invest on primary level care. There are experiments in countries like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Tamil Nadu, who have built their public system depending on primary care and have been able to provide adequately good financial protection. And I also mentioned that medicine is a major cause of impoverishment due to health. And there are, in India, Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan have actually modernized their medicine procurement system, and they are providing good quality medicine all completely free, and it has brought down out-of-pocket expenditure significantly. And also it's not only about financing but also rational care. The last point I would like to just, I'll take 1 minute. If you essentially depend on a private sector model for insurance, you are giving way to increasing oligopolization and monopolization of the health industry. The way health sector works, it cannot work in a model of competitiveness. Monopoly has enormous advantage because we have advantages of scale in healthcare industry. So if you let private sector grow freely, you will see that larger oligopolies and monopolies are taking shape, and then containing cost would be almost impossible, like we see in many of the countries, and even in some of the Scandinavian countries where health spending is getting more than 10%. The classic case is the US, where only 1/6 of total resources are being spent on health, and yet a large section of the population remains uncovered. And I would say that the best way to govern unruly private sector is through economic mechanisms, which is to provide good quality functioning public system. The global experience is that is how you bring private sector costs down. Thank you so much.
Alright, thank you so
Music to
much.
your ears.
What a resounding conclusion that you had. We are 10 minutes over time. The Vice Chancellor just called. He's wishing us all well and winding up the session, but somebody probably has a burning question or comment to make on this report. There's one thing I'd like to suggest, though, if it's possible. You talked about finished research that you've done, and perhaps that could be made available for those of us who want to delve into it in detail. But who would like to?
I think, I just wanted to say it's a very happy choice of word that he's inadvertently chosen. Layers. He meant layers, but it is actually layers.
Sorry.
Yeah, actually, it's deliberate.
Yes.
Deliberate, yeah, because it's 100% hard.
You had a quick question.
Just a question, not about the modeling, but does it mention anywhere in the fine print of any of the schemes if they cover outdoor patient expenditure or indoor, like
Hospitalized.
so just hospitalization, not because most of the a bigger chunk of all the expenses are borne due to outdoor expenditures, right?
Yes.
And none of the insurance scheme covers that.
OPDs.
OPDs.
So there are experiments happening. There are some pilots happening to include OPD as part of insurance, but
But unless it's
risk in OPD.
sorry.
How will you assess risk in OPD?
yeah.
So of course it's almost impossible. So the better way is to definitely provide and have gatekeeping rules.
So publicly बड़ा अच्छा है.
Yes,
Aspire
very
to step out
excellent.
first.
No,
You will end up doing healthcare.
Where are you publishing this?
So BMC Public Health has accepted this paper.
So So let's publicize that then. So it's being published by the
BMC.
BMC. Okay, so that will be available and it will be probably, at least at this university, gets announced in the media coverage for those who are not, well, everybody's from here, right? So you all know where to find that when it comes out, log into it, read it. It sounds like a terrific report. I'm keenly interested in it myself. So with this, I think we need to conclude. You are very fortunate that time is so short. I will not be able to give my 45-minute summary of what transpired in this afternoon session. But I would like to invite, I guess according to protocol, it should be perhaps Sudarshan who gives the vote of thanks,
No, you should do that.
Oh, you should do it, yes. You have to drape our guests
Yes.
with.
No, he doesn't get it, only Suraj.
All right, only Suraj. So Suraj gets.
There's one with Suraj's name on it.
Oh, there's one with his name on it.
Yes, yes.
All right, all right.
This is like you got